You know what time it is? It's time for another short video. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about a book I just finished, The Religion of the Ancient Celts by J.A. MacCulloch. Now, you can find this book online actually. Maybe I'll put a hyperlink somewhere, maybe right there. Um, I read this book for my research into the book I want to write on the set in the 8th century. So, and it's going to have a lot of religious stuff in it. So I want to do some background research on the Celts and on different religions that form the backdrop of the atmosphere of the culture of that sort of newly Christianized world. So MacCulloch was a book that kept cropping up when I'd look up books on Celtic religion. It's pretty old. I guess you'd call it a classic or whatever. I just, about a year or two ago, I read a book on Norse mythology, and I'll link it right here as well or whatever. And it was really good, but you know, the funny thing is, Norse mythology, of course, is pretty popular now because of the Marvel comics with Thor and Marvel movies, sorry, with Thor and Loki and all that. So I was okay. So the book on they're very different books, okay, and I'm not 100% sure whether that's because the source material is very different or whether the authors of the two books are very different. So the book on the religion of the ancient Celts is very scholarly. It's much slower going than the book on Norse mythology. And I kept wondering as I was reading it whether that's simply because the source material is different. So what I mean by that is that perhaps there are one or two authoritative sources of Norse mythology, and they're kind of coherent books, like the Edda, I think is what it's called, EDDA. I'll put it right up there. That it's a sort of a unified single source, whereas my guess is there's no such unified single source on Celtic religion. So, and this comes across in the book, MacCulloch's book, where he has to quote a variety of sources. So you have him quoting Julius Caesar, you have him quoting other ancient authors, even St. Augustine, and another big source is tendentious, and it's of course the works that that follow from the Celtic world or whatever. So what I mean is that, like, the books surrounding Arthurian legends and so on. So it's interesting that some of the people, like King Arthur, was apparently at one point, like, I guess he was maybe one of the Celtic gods. That's what they're thinking, one of the Celtic gods in Britain. And so that's one thing you discover, is that, like, mortals become gods and gods become mortals. And I don't mean according to the mythology, although that sometimes happens, but I mean according to the way that the people understood those people. And also there was another person like that, let me just think, from Shakespeare's play, King Lear. So it's interesting that Lear apparently was one of the Celtic gods at one point or another before he was turned into one of the kings. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, he appears in the History of the Kings of Britain or whatever, that book. But anyway, so what I'm trying to say is that whereas there's one sort of authoritative source on Norse mythology, there is no such single source from Celtic mythology. And that's why you have a very different kind of book that's sampling from a whole bunch of different sources. Some are classic, so the time of Julius Caesar and so on, and some are medieval, and some are, you say, almost early modern, in a sense that, like, it's interesting. One thing that the author points out, MacCulloch points out, is that some Celtic practices, superstitions, and so on were still alive and well in his own time. And again, we're talking about 100 years ago. So, well, that's an interesting thing. Now, the Celts, in a nutshell, the Celts were not the original people in Europe. I think that the original people in Europe were the Neanderthals, but were unearly people, and I guess Indo-European. So we're looking at the common racial stock that unites most of Europe with Iran and India and so on. So and as time goes by and new migrations happen, so in the late Roman Empire, there were the Germanic migrations, and the Germanic migrations tended to push the Celtic people westward. So they're being pushed into Spain, and they're being pushed up into Great Britain, okay, Scotland, Ireland, and England. And I think Wales is different from Anglo-Saxon world, because these are the Celtic people, and they're kind of separated out by mountains, basically. So and also one thing to keep in mind is that there's also Celts in modern day Turkey, and I remember them as a sort of a distinct people that you have to talk about when you're talking about the in Roman times, when you're talking about the push of the Roman Empire eastward. I think it was Galatia. There's Galicia in Spain, and I think Galatia in Asia Minor. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, that's the place where. So there's a Celtic kingdom in Turkey. And now, if I've got that wrong, I'll put it up here on the video. So anyway, should you read this book? Yeah, it's not as fun or easy a read as, for instance, the book on Nordic mythology, but I did get a lot out of it. What did I learn? Okay, so I learned that it talks a lot about, for instance, the difference between the Druids and the Celts, and they're not sure, but there's a strong idea that the Druids are a pre-Celtic people, a pre-Celtic religion that kind of morphed into and survived within the Celtic world, and that's kind of cool. And so the book talks about a lot of the practices of the Druids and lots of practices and beliefs of the Celtic people. You cover such things as human sacrifice, for instance. Talk about the different festivals. There's lots of exotic things, like, as I said, human sacrifice. There's mention of orgies in terms of fertility things. They talk about, the book talks a lot about the role of female gods, and that really the Celtic religion was sort of female dominated for most of time, it looked like. And so there was a heavy emphasis on the fertility and Mother Earth and those kinds of things. So in terms of my own research, I definitely want to hit on some of the exotic things and the longevity of some of the beliefs and superstitions of the people. There's a lot of interesting talk, especially towards the end of the book, on the relationship between like the Celtic, between, say, for instance, the Druids and then the famous Celtic saints or whatever, like Saint Columba in Scotland. And then you have, for instance, and Saint Patrick, and so, like, the way in which it's so interesting that the attributes of the divinities and of the magic of the Druids begins to be ascribed to the Christian saints as well. So it's very interesting in that regard, and the contest between the Christian authorities and the older Druidic authorities and so on. So if you don't mind a scholarly style, and a scholarly style, I would say, is is very metered, contingent, parenthetical. So scholars don't just say things. They say, well, this, this person thinks this source presents it like this, and this source doesn't, but I tend to side with this source because of this reason. Whereas the book on Nordic mythology is just basically storytelling, and it's very interesting. But the stories of the Nordic gods versus the ice giants and all that stuff. So it's a very different kind of book. But since you can get it online, hey, you can read up on it. You can get an audiobook. I'm going to keep reading in the field because this book was so old. I'm definitely going to need an update. So I'm going to be looking for a book on Celtic mythology that's written in the last couple decades or whatever. So anyway, it puts me in a better position, I'd say, for the novel I want to write, the historical novel I want to write. But it's by no means a done deal, but it definitely gave me some food for thought. So anyway, hope you guys are doing great today, tonight, and that's all for now. Bye, guys.